We're glad you're here. Welcome. I'm Felicity Ezewike. Africa suffers more than any other region from malaria, accounting for 94% of cases and 95% of deaths worldwide. Incidents of malaria are on the rise, but so are efforts to fight it. If you follow the news, I'm sure by now you must have heard of the 2 revolutionary malaria vaccines being rolled out across the continent. Well, if you haven't, I can tell you there is some excitement about its potential to make a significant impact towards eradicating malaria. On the flip side, there are some disappointment at the pace of rollout of the R21 vaccine since it was approved in October last year. It took 6 months compared to the COVID-19 vaccine that was approved on New Year's Eve of 2020 and rolled out in several countries the very next week. I point this out because in that same year, malaria killed more people in Africa than COVID-19 did. What's the hold-up with the rollout and how can we hasten it? Importantly, is it really the magic bullet against malaria as it's being touted? We're going to try and get some informed view on the subject matter in one slot today. And my guest is Dr. Francis Ohanyido. He is the Director General, West African Institute of Public Health. He joins us from Abuja. Doctor, thank you for giving us your time. My very first question was, why are African countries so vulnerable to malaria? Are the statistics being given and quoted all over the place accurate to your knowledge?
Okay, thank you very much. It's always a delight to be on your program. I think first we need to understand that the statistics are correct. If anything, I think the statistics may just be a tip of the iceberg. What's called the tip of the iceberg phenomenon is probably even more than this. Because if you really look at health-seeking behavior in Africa and some parts of the world, use of antibiotics and drugs, the way people use them, abuse them and all that, may affect the picture of how we see malaria generally. But that said, we need to first understand that malaria has a risk region, what we call the malaria endemic region, which is somewhere around the tropic and subtropical latitudes of our planet as we know it. And but the bulk of it is in sub-Saharan Africa, what we call sub-Saharan Africa. Africa's southwest of Sahara, which Nigeria, for example, is one. So that is one. So last year alone, we based on both projections and evidence, based on case incidents, we had over case incidents of over 250 million. And if you look at that, 250 million globally for malaria. And if you look at that, like I said, it's the tip of the iceberg phenomenon. It may actually be less than, much more than that we're seeing. And then we had deaths in the region of over 600,000. And this 600,000, the bulk of it were in children under 5 years old. And the bulk of it was in Africa. And if you look at the stats, it actually shows that 94% of the incidents are here in Africa, and 95% of the deaths are here in Africa. So Africa carries disproportionate amount of the burden of malaria, globally. Although this picture might change with global warming and the effects that we're seeing now with vectoriality being augmented by the fact that certain regions that were either a bit cold, temperate, are becoming warmer with global warming. So the vectors are beginning to move into those areas. So the malaria endemic belt may actually broaden with global warming.
Oh,
That's said. So the statistics are correct. And the statistics are actually even probably just a tip of the iceberg phenomenon, if you want to look at it.
Wow.
But it gives us a working scenario to be able to appreciate the enormity of what we're dealing with.
Indeed. I mean, we needed to establish that so we know why the hype around this vaccine is being celebrated so much. What is special about it? We've had other anti-malaria medicines, we've had insecticide-treated nets, we've had all kinds of efforts to combat malaria, but we don't seem to be winning. Is this the magic bullet? What is special about it?
I'm careful to say it's the magic bullet, but I think it's close enough to a magic bullet. The reason is this. The Plasmodium parasite is highly invasive. It changes rapidly. And one of the things that this vaccine, the two types, the RTS S and the R21 do, is that they actually target a level of the parasite where it's not able to begin to navigate across the tissues of the body and target certain proteins in this parasite to make it easier for the person's immune system to be able to wipe them off. So it's a very good vaccine in that sense. And the celebration is very germane. I know how many of us have not gone to work at one point or the other in our lives because we had malaria. It may seem something that the morbidity rate is high here in Africa. A lot of people go through it practically once in a while, once in a year, once in months, and it affects even the quality of our economies, because if you have more people suffering from malaria, the morbidity level is so high that it can affect an economy.
All
so
right,
we have reasons to celebrate it.
All right, we've established the fact that it is something important and to be celebrated. I'll also be asking you about how long the protection is, but something you said about us, being sick and it's affecting children more. If the goal is to eradicate malaria and the vaccine, correct me if I'm wrong, is targeted at children, what about adults? Adults are also susceptible to malaria. So if the goal is eradication, is it focusing on children? Will that be the edge? What is the rationale in this thinking? Or is the vaccine for both the adult and children?
Okay, so the vaccine works for both adults and children. But the initial gateway is for children, because if you look at the deaths, the proportion of deaths, under 5 children constitutes about almost 80 to 90% of the deaths from malaria. Because the adult immune system is stronger relatively and they're able to ward off some of these effects of the organism. But children are not able to manage them as well as adults. And some of the collateral damages that occur in malaria includes things like even brain damage because of high level of the temperature that the children exhibit. And that's why you see mothers have to tepespon children when they're running fever, and all that. So it has a lot of collateral effect. It can damage kidney, can damage those things. Don't happen as much as that in adults. So the first place we start are the most vulnerable groups, like any other vaccine. You remember even during COVID, we targeted more of those who, in the first layer of surge, to be able to protect those who are like vulnerable groups, like in COVID, who are above like 55, 60s in some countries, because we are vulnerable groups to that. So it's the same thing with malaria vaccine. The most vulnerable group of our young children, about 500 deaths annually. It's unimaginable globally. So it's something that we target the children first, then gradually, and if we're able to get some level of even herd immunity with time, the adults will be protected. So the issue of this thing. So that is vulnerabilities, the main reason, is the main decision marker for starting with children.
Okay, what is the lifespan of this vaccine? Is it once you take it, you don't need to take another vaccine, or there is intermittent period for you to take it? And are there any potential side effects that are being noticed with this vaccine that might need some caution moving forward?
Okay, so these two vaccines are basically not one-off vaccine. They are in dosages, repeated dosages, at least 4 dosages from a child who is, let's say, 5 months. You don't give it to children less than 5 months. It's mostly for children from 5 months onwards, so that you can also be able to monitor what effects are on them. So far, the results have been very impressive. Some of the basic side effects are usual side effects sometimes from any vaccination, in terms of mild fever, even sometimes reaction at site of injection, at where the vaccine was given and all that. But there have not been any case of life-threatening cases that we so far have documented. But it does not mean that they will not be there, because human beings are different. The way we react to extraneous compounds in our system vary, and the way we react to them. So it's time will tell. But the point is that on average, the protection rate is high and it's doing very well among the vulnerable groups that we are targeting. So the idea is that they should have at least for the RTSS that they started with, at least 4 doses of that. Countries can define how that will fall within their calendar in terms of how they do the expanded immunization program in those countries. But basically, that's the idea.
Okay.
So, and the R21 is actually relatively more potent than the RTSS. With the dosage level, as you increase the dosage, it shows practically more potency relative to the RTSS. So, but these are variable, but their protection are almost similar. Their mode of functions are similar. Their construct in terms of how they were prepared are very similar. So, except that some differences in structure, but the scaffold is the same in terms of the component elements that were put together to compound them.
Okay. Earlier, I mentioned we had other existing malaria control strategies, treatment strategies and programs. How will the vaccines be integrated with these existing malaria control strategies, or is it a standalone, medicine, treatment rather, for malaria?
Yeah, so like every other thing that involves part of an immunization scheme, we need to understand that first and foremost, it has to be part of an immunization program. And this immunization program, we now integrate it into the health system so that if a mother brings a child that is within that age, or a person of the age, if we expand it, comes to that, the person will be able to avail his or herself or avail that child the access to that vaccine, and be able to work with it. But that does not mean that within the system, because the vaccine will not immediately go around, the other interventions in terms of drugs, in terms of nets, in terms of environmental protection, whether larvicidal and other protections are used, that's vector management processes, they will still be ongoing. But the advantage we have here with the vaccine is that once a vaccine is within the health system, it will help us begin to gradually begin to achieve some level of cover. If you have a community that is totally covered with, let's say, that in terms of the vulnerable groups, you have already covered a large chunk of that community's population in sense of those who will fall ill. As you know, the children are the most vulnerable, like I mentioned earlier. So that's an advantage for that community. And there'll be less deaths from it. But other people who don't have access to this have to go through the process of getting their normal treatment after they are diagnosed for malaria, their normal treatment, and where they have to be protected, they have to use nets in areas of high presence of the organism and the vector. So they have to use mosquito nets to be able to protect themselves going forward.
All right, I really wish you had more time. That little interruption at the opening took a bit of our time, but I want you to talk about affordability and how this vaccine will be accessible to especially low-income populations in Africa, because we've seen time and time again how this class of citizens are impacted when things like this are rolled out. Would it be affordable for these low-income people? What is the plan in that regard, if you know about?
Okay, so Nigeria, for example, I'll give you an example. Nigeria, for example, wants to roll out the R21 vaccine, and basically it's going to become the second country after Ghana in terms of using that particular vaccine. But it has to be gated through government, the public sector, because at this stage, the people who are most vulnerable and the children of the group that are most vulnerable are the ones, who cannot be able on their own to purchase that vaccine. So it's important that it comes through the government system and it's free for now. So like most other vaccine, those who can afford it later on when it gets to private sector, we encourage them to also have some of those vaccines so that we're able to access them from private sector side. As you know, Nigeria has a lot of, or most countries in Africa, they have a large mix in terms of presence of private sector actors in the system. So it's important they are part of that. so that the access will be there for those who can actually afford it from private sector, so that it will broaden the reach where government cannot give to all the vulnerable people that targets. So that's very, very important in terms of how you approach it.
Okay, there's been some disappointment in terms of the pace, the rollout of the vaccine compared to when we had COVID. Understandably, there was some urgency because COVID was, going out of control. But then again, there are concerns and some conspiracy theories. But I would like you to speak about some of the concerns at the level of rollout of the vaccine. Ghana was the first country in the world to approve the highly anticipated vaccine at the time. But did that translate to their rollout, and how did that impact other parts of Africa?
Okay, so there's a bit of, I need to clarify something.
Go ahead.
During COVID, that comparison doesn't really follow so much. During COVID, there was a lot of things that were, I would call, within the landscape that happened. One, it was a global threat. It was considered a global threat. So the momentum in terms of building a bandwagon effect for deployment and malaria has been with us for a while. There's always that status quo bias in things. When you've been with that thing for a while, it's not novel. You tend to take your time. So that is a human thing. And then, of course, the system. Remember that when the COVID thing happened, the Africa CDC was just getting itself into place, and it saw it as an opportunity to run and show what it was capable of doing within the Africa health system, the ecosystem of Africa and all that. And it did a lot of work around that. But if you look at the malaria vaccine, the initial work, precursor work around it was controlled or managed from WHO through the malaria vaccine implementation program. And that program was taking its time because it needed to be very careful. They didn't want any fallback. We just came out of COVID environment. And if people, for any reason, feel suddenly that this vaccine is something that is, and a lot of misinformation. So coming out of COVID, WHO and the world needed to be very careful in rolling out this vaccine. So the initial countries, Ghana, Malawi, and Kenya, were actually done intentionally to be able to prove that the acceptability was there, that it could be accessed within the typical health system, and also to see how people responded to it, whether the children responded to it well or they didn't. Some of those things were very important in terms of rolling it out. So it was now gradually that other countries could see it was possible to be able to onboard themselves into the malaria program. So the structures were a bit different or a bit different. So the way they move will have been quite different. And of course, the life-threatening part that was perceived around COVID-19 was very critical in terms of getting the kind of speed that COVID got.
All right, there was some stuff that I read that talked about unnecessary bottleneck in trying the distribution of the vaccine. And again, I mentioned conspiracy theories. One of them is that the pace is not as it should be. There are so many things that are unnecessary in the efforts to try and distribute this, because it mainly affects Africa and not the whole world, or maybe part of some special European countries and all of that. I wanted to put that conspiracy to rest.
Okay, so yes, so the point is this: that has been a common thing where a particular region, particularly Africa, is most underserved in anything. It tends to suffer those consequences, and we all know that. And we cannot pretend. We saw vaccine hoarding during the vaccine nationalism during COVID. So it clearly showed that attention, if it's not an existential threat for the whole of humanity, Africa will tend to suffer. And it keeps reoccurring every time. But gradually, Africa is beginning to own its own health system. That's why we have the African Medicine Agency that's been formed. We have all sorts of structures that have come up, including the Africa CDC, to be able to begin to walk the talk on our own, irrespective of what the challenges may be, that we should at least start owning our health systems and not waiting and be over-dependent for external this thing. But like I said, the malaria vaccine implementation program is housed in WHO, and of course, some of a multilateral like that has to be also careful as it works with countries, and how some of those things pan out may be even dependent on the country where they work, on how they work with those countries from the Africa regional office. So some of those things play out, and I cannot begin to talk about all of them. I think someone from WHO may be able to give more light or shed more light around that. But indeed, sometimes we see the tendency about Africa being ignored, about Africa getting the butt of everything, about Africa not seen as the place to even invest to secure that, So there's investment coming in malaria, actually the outcomes of malaria have improved in Africa, but then, of course, those things are there. So the conspiracy theories may not be totally what looks like or what they've been propagated, but there's some sense in terms of how we are treated.
Fair enough.
So those things are there.
Fair enough, because some of the people that I read that were talking about it they were trying to say that they have evidence of this, but they can't put it out there and all of that. So there must be some, but again, we should stop crying, really. The vaccine, can't we produce it here? Is it not something that we already have a vaccine production facility across Africa? South Africa has, I think Ghana has as well. I'm not sure which other country has. Can't we produce this vaccine locally? Is that something that is in the works?
Okay, so that's, this vaccine, especially the R21, was produced by Oxford University. And of course, there are things around the rights and proprietary rights around that. I think a lot of that have been discussed during COVID in terms of how these things work out, from the World Trade Organization level and coming down. But I think there can be some level of agreement, considering that Africa is the biggest sufferer of this problem of malaria, to make sure that as this a game point for us to be able to move quickly towards the eradication of malaria, and this gives us a tool to be able to move towards that direction easily. I think it's for that arrangement to be the way we did with some of the COVID vaccines, to be able to have some local backstop in terms of production, to be able to make it accessible to Africans much more freely on the continent, rather than waiting for it to be imported into the continent. But I think that will happen gradually.
Okay, this year, I mean, the COVID is gone now, thankfully. We're not talking about COVID. The concentration should be on how we can eradicate malaria. And some scholars in your field are saying that this is the year many vulnerable young African children will have access to not just one, but two malaria vaccines. And I guess that's where the magic bullet is coming from. Is this the year that we will be talking less about malaria?
Yeah, so you just pointed out the logistic issues that have been bogging down the scale up, So, but I think with time, there will be momentum. I don't think this year, but if we look at it from the point of the Sustainable Development Goals, I think by 2030, we'll have made a lot of mileage and gained a lot of milestones in terms of where we are with incidence of malaria on the continent, especially with children, through rolling out this vaccine. I think within that timeline, we will see palpable evidence that it's working and that it's bringing benefits to that. And the long-term benefits, the economy of Africa, So, and then we can begin to scale up beyond children and looking at how we can be able to make sure that people don't fall sick from malaria and miss work and be able to add less to the economy of our country and all that.
Okay, I want you to address specifically Nigeria and the concerns around access to this vaccine. What would you advise the Ministry of Health, the federal government, and practitioners in the field on how to make this vaccine accessible, especially to those in the rural communities?
Okay, so there's already the National Primary Healthcare Development Agency has been working around the clock in terms of around making sure that Nigerians who need to be vaccinated, especially children, get vaccinated. And with the recent, even the human papilloma virus vaccine and all that. So it has its work cut out for it. And I think he's doing the work, despite the challenges of the system and all the issues. But I think the main thing there is to make sure that we have a system that works. Currently, we have barely about 25% of our primary healthcare infrastructure that actually can deliver for us. So we need to make sure that out of that, about 30,000 of them, that they are working. We need to make sure that at least private sector involvement is key. Private health sector gives a lot of service in Nigeria, and whatever way we can onboard them to be able to expand the accessibility of this malaria vaccine in a way that is wholesome and does not bring unnecessary burden to Nigerians in trying to access the vaccine. We need to do that so that we'll be able to get a massive surge in terms of coverage with the vaccine.
All right, Doctor. I guess we'll have to leave it for now. Thank you very much for speaking with us. But please don't log out. We might just need to come back to you. We'll go on a short break. When we come back, more conversation here on One Slot. Just stay with us.